Hi everyone, my name is David Kellin. I'm an urban services and policy advisor in the ICRC. Today, we are going to see in this presentation some examples of coordination and operation when it comes to the humanitarian development and peace nexus. Generally, you'll see that there are four pillars in the ways of working that we consider. The first one being to have efficient coordination platform. This is quite obvious, but existing platform where actors interact with each other. The second one would be to build trust through adequate mechanisms, through knowing each other, and with the time, through working with each other. Often the actors involved in the nexus are not well aware of each other. Thirdly, develop the capacity for joint assessments, joint analysis, all the way to planning, action, and monitoring. So instead of planning and analyzing each in our own corner, as much as possible, have some degree of common planning. Finally, and in a very classic fashion, the ability to monitor, evaluate, and learn from all this to adjust in case of need. First example, the case of Gaza, and the question of how to strengthen emergency preparedness while at the same time restoring services for the longer term. And we'll start by listing the prerequisites that allow this to happen in the case of Gaza. The first one is that pretty much every actors had a prolonged period of presence in this place. So all actors, humanitarian development, service providers had a long time to learn about the place. Secondly, there were existing, and there still are existing, strong relationship between those partners. On the one hand, between Gaza main service providers, the water, the electricity, the Ministry of Local Administration, the Coastal Water Utility, all had a history and of communication, of cooperation, and extremely efficient coordination mechanisms, in particular in times of crisis. On the other hand, humanitarian and development actors had been interacting for many years, so they were not entirely new to each other. Next key success factor is that along the years and along the crisis, emergency preparedness plans were developed, reinforced, and available. In parallel to that, there had been also enormous work and much collaboration on the topic of prioritization, how to sequence longer term works and planning for not just the crisis, but the long term. It is all of the above points that made it possible for all the actors together to come out with a comprehensive plan to respond to emergency, but at the same time to work on the resilience of services. And not only individual and separate services, but to approach the whole concept of resilience with all the interconnections and complex interconnectivity that exists between the different services. In that sense, and as a recap of this Gaza case, you could call this one a best case scenario. The point on joint assessments, joint analysis, planning, action, and monitoring could be fully implemented between the whole scope, particular humanitarian development, financing, organization, and the local communities and the local service providers. So it went into full scope in this case. In the same way, the point below, the whole project and the whole history of this project was inclusive in that the local service providers were central and in a lead position at all time, but also the needs and feedback of communities were taken into account and allowed the actors to learn from it. The challenges that came out, because this was one of the first large concrete such cooperation, is quite typical and was what you could call thinking in silos, with on the one hand humanitarians keeping maybe their emergency responder mentality or thinking, and on the other hand developers or planners missing the shorter term or missing crisis elements while thinking exclusively on the long term. Now the result in this particular case was quite a success, where both, or actually the multiple array of professionals, were able to go beyond their field of origin, beyond their typical thinking, and get together and come out with a plan and projects that really go across the board. Okay, the second example you're familiar with as well is the case of Aleppo in Syria during the heat of the conflict. You have seen it before, I believe, but this is the case of a very large water supply infrastructure designed to serve millions, and where the water treatment plant and intake represent a single point of failure. Failure on which the water treatment plants, or possibly on the big component of the system, would result in a prolonged, possibly very long disruption of the service, again for those millions of people. Now the responses, I should say, to the multiple crises that happened and are still happening to that system were staged from very short term to long term. The first one was, of course, emergency response. Classic emergency water source, a lot of water trucking, drilling and equipping additional emergency wells and water sources within the city. In parallel to that, and moving to this day, classic forms of support to the service providers, in that case the water boards, with whether engineering projects or provision of spare parts, material, consumables, were part of our response, were part of everyone's response. And furthermore, an initiative that started 1-2 years ago, and with the ambition of looking into the next decade of that system, is what in the ICRC we coined the Too Big to Fail initiative. The idea of which being that after emergency response, after the more mid-term, long-term classic assistance to the water board, we have the ambition to go into larger projects planned over a duration of 5 to 10 years. So already we're touching a different kind of expertise, and for which we are seeking the same sort of cooperation with development actors or actors more familiar in the longer term. This is something that is starting now, and this would be, if you want, the third part in this nexus engagement that we are searching in this case. Now, looking at opportunities and challenges in this case, the opportunities that mostly humanitarian actors were here twofold. The first one was a high level of coordination, and along the first years of the conflict, a pretty tight and strong relationship to service providers. First and foremost, the water board, the Ministry of Water Resources, but also the municipality, the town authorities, and with the population as well. So there was definitely a strong level of coordination. In the early years of the crisis, the little number of actors made it even more easy to stay in touch and have excellent coordination among humanitarians. Secondly, the presence on the ground is, of course, a game changer. In this case and in the early years, UNICEF, ICRC, and their main partner, the SARC, were all present on the ground at all time, making it possible to learn, interact, communicate instantly. So that were a very strong point. Challenges in a case like Aleppo are a little bit different. And then what I will flag for you here in this presentation is that when it comes to the nexus, when it comes to moving into development, peace, and involving traditional actors of this field, contexts so politicized as is Syria, but that applies to many contexts. Contexts that are under international sanctions or really part of a greater game of geopolitics can make the collaboration a little bit more tricky and can result in having humanitarians present on the ground, but with less ability from other actors to jump in. To this day, in the case of Aleppo, this remains one of the challenges that we are facing. Now, you will tell me, okay, the two examples are interesting, but very much with an emphasis on the two first elements of the nexus, humanitarian and development. What about peace? And indeed, for us, water professionals or technical professionals in general, the integration of the peace component of the nexus is not always obvious to grasp and not always obvious to operationalize. Yet, you can always find connections. They are there, and it's really up to us professionals to seek them. In this slide, I'm splitting it in two. On the left side, you see you can go one way, where conflicts, that is the lack of peace, are leading to specific needs, humanitarian or development. On the right side, it goes the other way around. You could say that poor essential services or a limited or unequal access to resources can lead to tensions and could be contributing factors to conflict. So looking at how conflict impacts the needs, I mean, this is the terrain we're more accustomed to. We're talking about the outbreak of a crisis or a conflict that creates classic humanitarian or on the long-term development needs. And there, understanding not just the technical cause, but understanding the social, political, environmental context that could lead to potential conflicts or that have been part of the root causes of an existing conflict is key and has to be part, even as an engineer, of our analysis. And that means that the coordination, the discussion with peace actors when they are present, or peace literature, are very relevant, even for engineers. It means that our plans must include those risks, must include those dynamics, and wherever possible, our plans and our programs must propose proactive measures in response to a crisis. So that would be preparedness, or to lower, I would say, the tensions and act on the potential root causes. Now, we should not fool ourselves. It's not only just water that triggers war, but wherever possible and to a sensible extent, this is part of our job as engineers to include it. And that links to the second part of the slide, where we know that inequalities generate tensions. So in situations of underdevelopment, in situation of humanitarian crisis, natural disaster, conflict, these inequalities tend to be made even worse, accentuated. The access to basic services or the access to a key resource, I mean, typically water, can be very disparate. This is true from a very local level, between two households within a small community. This can be true all the way to transboundary water management, transboundary issues, and lead to, at both levels, to conflict and tensions. And then again, it is our job as engineers, and makes a lot of sense in our analysis and inception and execution of projects, to include those elements, think about it, and see how we can possibly twist our programs to act as much as possible on these tension factors. Finally, of course, learning is key, and in that sense, having community engagement or consultation, listening to what our beneficiaries, be it the populations or the service providers, tell us, allows us to modify. We might realize that in the course of a project, tensions arise and that we can actually correct it. And with that, I conclude this short presentation on the triple nexus coordination examples. You will find more literature here, and I'll find you later in another presentation. Thank you.